Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and in this lecture we are going to learn about the life and works of Karolina Karlovna Pavlova. Karolina Karlovna Pavlova was born Karolina Karlovna Janusz in 1807 to a Russified German family. Her father was a doctor and a teacher, and she was raised in Moscow and received an unusually good education for a woman. She was educated at home, which was the only possibility for women at that time. And she was educated in all kinds of subjects, including the sciences and astronomy and multiple foreign languages, and quickly became known as a very talented and intelligent young woman, and especially became known from an early age for her translations. And translation at the time was considered to be an acceptable thing for a woman to do. Lots of authors, both male and female, did translation either for money or for another thing to do, or in order to make important foreign works available to the Russian public. But particularly translation was considered to be a suitable thing for a woman to do because it was considered to be passive. You were not creating your own work, but merely acting as a passive vessel to translate somebody else's work. And this was considered to be okay for a woman to do. It was considered to be an inherently female activity because it was considered to be so passive. But Karolina Karlovna decided to also start writing her own original work, which, as we will see discussed in her novel, was considered to be a very transgressive thing to do. However, in her early life, she quickly became known as a talented translator, and people were happy to associate with her and support her in that activity, which was considered to be appropriate. And she also moved in the highest literary society of the time in 1825, so when she was still a very young woman. She became engaged to the Polish poet Adam Mickiewicz, whose picture you see there on the right of the slide. And he was Poland's foremost poet. They met while he was in Moscow after being essentially exiled there, following his participation in the Polish uprising against Russian rule. Karolina Karlovna was apparently very deeply in love with him, but according to rumors, her parents didn't support the match because he had no money and was, not a politically acceptable person to marry. And maybe he kind of got tired of the match too. And so the match was broken off and he left and went back to Poland, and that was it for them. And apparently she had been very much in love with him and suffered very much over the break-off of the match. After the break-off of the engagement with Adam Mickiewicz, Karolina Karlovna went on to continue working on her translations, to start working on her own original works, and she reached her late 20s without getting married, which meant that she was basically an old maid, and there was little hope of her getting married, which was a terrible fate at the time, although very common and widespread. But then she ended up inheriting some money and became, a rich prospective bride. And Nikolai Pavlov, whom you see there on the right of the slide, he married her in 1836, and he supposedly married her for her money. He openly admitted it at the time. And the marriage quickly became an unhappy one, although they maintained one of the best literary salons in Moscow. And again, maintaining a literary salon was an acceptable activity for a woman because you were supporting others in doing their work. You weren't doing original creative work yourself. You were supporting the original creative work of others. And so women with literary ambition or literary interests could, and often did, maintain these literary salons where they held regular meetings and invited the leading literary lights of the day to come and give talks and readings. And so she did that, and that was popular and socially acceptable. However, she also started presenting her own work there, her own original work there, and that was considered to be a major faux pas and not acceptable. Furthermore, the marriage with Pavlov didn't go well. The marriage was unhappy. He probably never really loved her. and he ended up gambling away most of her inheritance. So it was pretty unhappy all around. She ended up divorcing him and reporting him to the authorities for his behavior. And as part of that, the authorities came and searched his office and discovered a number of banned literary works there. And this got him in trouble, and society turned against Karolina Karlovna for her part in this. Although she was clearly the person who had been wronged and that he basically stole her money, he was cheating on her with her own cousin, whom she had taken into the household as her ward. And, it may be wrong that those works that he had were banned. Maybe they shouldn't have been banned, but they were banned. And so he was knowingly breaking the law. But nonetheless, she was blamed for his problems, and she ended up divorced, disgraced, and basically having to leave the country in order to flee Moscow society. In the 1830s and 40s, while she was still living in Moscow and was part of the Russian literary community, Karolina Karlovna wrote a great deal of her own original poetry, and she also wrote the novel that we read for this course, A Double Life, which, as you see, is written half in prose and half in poetry. And the novel was published in Russia and received some acclaim, but people were also very confused by it. After her divorce and disgrace, and she had to leave the country and basically live out the rest of her life in poverty abroad, she continued to write poetry, but it received very little attention in Russia or elsewhere. And she died in 1893, largely forgotten by the Russian literary community. However, her writing was revived only a few years later, so she almost lived long enough to see this. It's very tragic. Her writing was revived just a couple years later, basically, by Valery Brusov, whose picture you can see there on the left. And Valery Brusov is an extremely interesting and influential character in Russian literature. His actual works are not normally read or taught. He's not a canonical major writer the way some of the others are, which I think is kind of unfortunate. His work's actually quite interesting, but he's not a canonical major writer the way some of his contemporaries are. But he had a huge influence on Russian literature, because he actively promoted new and different forms of literature and was actively looking around the world, especially to Europe, looking for new forms of literature, looking for new and interesting writers, experimenting with new forms and genres. And one of the things he did was revive Karolina Pavlova's writing and introduce it to a new generation of Russian authors. And she was taken up by this new early 20th century generation of Russian authors and became a major source of inspiration for them, especially for female authors such as Marina Tsvetaeva and Anna Akhmatova, who became known as some of the best Russian poets of the 20th century. And one of the things that Valery Brusov did was he actively promoted female poets. We probably wouldn't call him a feminist as such, as we understand it now. But like I said, he was very interested in new and different poets and new and different forms. And he brought Karolina Pavlova's writing to the attention of a new generation, and then also supported female poets of the 20th century like Marina Tsvetaeva early in their careers. So that was one of the many important things he did. He also probably served as an inspiration for Mikhail Bulgakov, whom we'll talk about later. In any case, Karolina Pavlova's writings were rediscovered around the turn of the 20th century, and she became an inspiration for the next generation of female poets, which was the first really major generation of female authors in Russian literature. And she has continued to gain scholarly attention around the world. And although she is not considered to be completely canonical like Pushkin or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, she is considered to be more and more important the more she is studied, both for her literary qualities, which are quite impressive, and for her outspoken feminism. And so the two things mean that she was really ahead of her time. Like, no one knew what to do with her at the time when she was actually writing. But as often happens with really great writers, she was rediscovered a couple of generations later, at which point people were ready to accept what she had to say and ready to appreciate what she brought to Russian literature. So, although during her lifetime she did not receive the respect that she undoubtedly deserved, and in fact was treated very shabbily, including authors with openly liberal tendencies who often spoke out against the mistreatment of women, they were very happy to speak out against the mistreatment of poor women who were not their social and intellectual equals. But when actually faced by a woman who was their social, intellectual, and artistic equal, they responded with angry personal attacks, denigration of her talent, and the argument that women should just not write poetry or just not write literature at all. It was just considered so beyond the pale for a woman to dare to engage in active creation in that way. And it was not until the 20th century that people were ready to engage with a female author who was engaged in active and original creation. However, in the 20th century, as I said, she served as a major source of inspiration for some of the most important writers of the 20th and now 21st centuries. So her legacy lives on and continues to grow in a very important way.